Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel and welcome if you are new here. My name is Andrea.M. and this is Real Crime Down Under. On November 10, 1986, a storekeeper was sweeping the pavement outside his shop when suddenly a young woman ran up to him. She was wearing only a pair of tights and a tank top. She was in extremely rough shape and was begging him to please call the police, adding, "If a woman follows me here and tells you she is my mother, don't believe her. I have just escaped from being abducted. I have also been assaulted." But before we get further into today's case, I would like to ask you all if you could please take a second to assault the like button. Also hit subscribe if you haven't done so already and share with your friends. It is people who subscribe to my channel just like you that help me get further on YouTube and allow me to make more videos for you guys just like this one. And now, without further ado, we are about to descend into the twisted world of Australia's worst serial killer couple, David and Catherine Burney. The case the media would dub the Moorehouse murders. And before I embark on today's story, I would like to give a trigger warning to prevent the re-traumatization of victims and survivors of crimes that are similar to this one. This story does contain quite an amount of violent content. It also contains sexual assault. It also contains harm to animals and harm and assault to persons under the age of 18 years. So if you are sensitive to this kind of content, this may not be the video for you. You may like to go and watch something else that I have made. With that being said, let's delve into the Moorehouse murders. Perth, known as the largest city in Western Australia, with year-round sunshine and a picturesque coastline. It is also the most isolated capital in the world. Its history and recognition of the City of Lights continues to intrigue people at home and abroad for its wildlife, Swan River and craft beer. It is also unfortunately known to be the location of the Moorehouse murders and the sadistic de facto husband and wife serial killers David and Catherine Burney. The couple met while in their teens, both born in 1951, coincidentally within a few suburbs of each other. Both David and Catherine had troubling and traumatic childhoods. David Burney was the firstborn of 5 children. Their mother Margaret and father John were both dysfunctional and abusive alcoholics. The father was also a physically handicapped man. The family lived in what was then a semi-rural suburb in eastern Perth named Wattle Grove. Rumours about familial incest abounded, and the Burney home was a filthy, unkempt mess. Mrs. Burney was also known for her short temper, her filthy mouth, and her dishevelled appearance. She was also known to refuse to cook or clean for her large family, so the children were often underfed and unwell. Mrs. Burney was also known, rumours abounded in the local community, that she would pay the local taxi drivers with sexual favours if she needed a ride and she had no money. The 5 Burney children had been removed several times from the home and taken into care by Child Protective Services. The family, when together, often attended Wattle Grove Baptist Church, where rumours began of the incest within the Burney family. At age 10, David's parents finally divorced, and David was then charged with taking care of his younger siblings, being that he was the eldest child. When they moved to the suburbs when David was aged 12, the Burneys began living next door to where a lonely, motherless 12-year-old girl, Catherine Harrison, lived with relatives, and David felt instantly drawn to Catherine. When she was only 2 years old, Catherine's mother Doreen had died, giving birth to a baby brother who then also died a few days later. Catherine moved to South Africa for a while, where she lived with her father Harold, and rumours began to circulate that maybe Catherine was actually being abused by her father. Until Harold decided that he was tired of being a single parent and it was not for him, and Catherine was shipped back to her maternal grandparents in Perth. Her grandparents were extremely strict and often would not even let Catherine out of the house. But in time, her grandmother actually suffered an epileptic seizure, and she was then shipped off again to live with an uncle and an aunt. And there's not a lot in the research of how Catherine got on while she was with her uncle and her aunt, but apparently it was pretty normal. However, at age 10, Harold decided, you know what, I want my daughter back. He applied for full custody, and somehow it was awarded to him despite the rumours of the incest. It is unknown if Catherine ever reported the rumoured abuse by her father to anyone, officially. By the time she met David at age 12, Catherine was dealing with abandonment issues and low self-esteem. The couple began dating at just age 14. Catherine was charmed by David, who she found well-educated and intelligent. David was attracted to Catherine's shy and reserved nature. Soon she was well and truly under David's thrall, and the two were soon getting into trouble with the law for break-and-enters and other petty theft. Catherine's father, Harold, tried keeping the couple apart. However, nothing he did would ever work, with Catherine always finding her way back to the charismatic David. This was until David and his siblings were once again removed from their parentless home by Child Protective Services. The 5 Burney children were then split up this time, and David and Catherine did lose touch with each other for a time. It was after this David distanced himself from both of his parents and went on to blame his upbringing for the issues he ended up with later in life. Blame the parents. At age 15, David left the foster home and got a job as an apprentice jockey at Ascot Racecourse. This career, however, would be short-lived after David was caught abusing the horses. The other staff had witnessed him punching and kicking them. But what was the nail in the coffin for David's job was he was also caught sneaking into the room of the elderly woman who owned the boarding house he was staying in. He was only wearing a pair of silk stockings over his face, and he went on to try and assault this elderly lady. Upon hearing of this, he was fired and banned from the racetrack. And this was not the first criminal act of David Burney. At just age 15, he was already had an extensive criminal history, and he had even been in jail for the misdemeanors and felonies he had even at such a young age already committed. He was also found to be a sex addict even at this young age, and he was found with a large collection of pornography and some pretty off-the-wall sexual interests. He claimed he had to have sex every day, and once, now this gets really icky, so you might want to fast forward a little, he asked his younger brother James if the two of them might have sex together, as he hadn't had any in a couple of days. James said an emphatic no to this. The younger boy then was awakened in the middle of the night by David trying to assault him. And what makes this case particularly horrible, at some stage the brothers actually ended up in prison as cellmates, and David got what he wanted anyway. This led to David going to James even after they were released from prison, when he needed a release, as he called it, and he could find no one else. Meanwhile, Catherine had also left school, dropping out at age 15, just like David. She got a job making blinds in a factory, and at this time fell back in touch with David. They fell back into old habits of thefting expensive items to fund their own expenses, and in June of 1969, they were arrested and pled guilty to 13 counts of theft and break-and-enter. They had stolen over $3,000, and this was a lot of money back then worth of goods. David was then sent back to prison for 3 years, and Catherine was given probation, probably owing to the fact of her being pregnant with another guy's baby. So she was given 4 years probation, and she was pregnant with somebody else's kid. However, it then came to light that they had been charged with a further 8 counts of break-and-enter and theft, and David was given another 3 years, and Catherine was given 4 years of probation. The couple saw each other briefly after David broke out of prison, but he was caught and sent back to finish out his sentence. Catherine was sentenced to 6 months jail for harbouring a fugitive and gave birth to her daughter in prison, whereupon the baby was immediately taken away by Child Protective Services. By the time David was released, Catherine had moved on with her life, and with the encouragement of her parole officer, she got a solid job as a nanny and a housekeeper for a Perth family. Her daughter was then returned to her, and she began seeing one of the family's elder sons, Don McLaughlin, whom she married and had a baby to on her 21st birthday, a boy named Donald Jr. Tragedy would strike, however, when young Donald was only 3 years old and he was struck by a car and passed away, with Catherine witnessing the entire event. So as you can see, Catherine's life has been extremely traumatic, and then she has to witness the passing of her first child with a very tragic accident. She did go on to have a further 6 children with Donald, and everything was going really well for Catherine and Donald until he was injured and could no longer work. It saw them move from their family home to the Housing Commission, where a very young Catherine was left to care for then 5 children and her now disabled husband. And this is the spooky part, that Catherine's family was now taking a similar turn to what David's family had been like, with many children, 1 primary caregiver and 1 disabled parent. Catherine also had no idea how to take care of the house, a disabled husband, and at that point 5 children on her own. And so, as with David's parents, the house fell into disrepair and was often filthy. The children were raised with very few rules and very little discipline. And in this time, David was once again on the street and had in fact met a woman and married her in 1972. The couple had had 1 daughter together, and David, at this stage of his life, had completely turned his life around, and he was doing really well. He was actually enjoying being a husband and a father, and that was until 1978 when David suffered a head injury in his place of work, and from then on his personality changed, and it was certainly not for the better. David was becoming emotionally abusive and was having extramarital affairs with underage girls and other young women. It was after 10 years of marriage when David arrived home with a 16-year-old girlfriend who he claimed would be moving in with them that his wife decided no. She'd had enough and packed her and their daughter's belongings, and they left. After the divorce, David had one thing on his mind. He wanted Catherine back. In 1983, Catherine was in hospital recovering from a hysterectomy when David, once again, tracked her down. David didn't care that Catherine was still married to Donald or that she had given birth to a child, number 6 at this time, and only 4 weeks after the birth, Catherine and David began an affair. This went on for 2 years, and yes, Catherine is still married to Donald at this stage. Until one day she called Donald and said she wasn't coming back. And that was it. That was all she wrote. She never came back. She left her disabled husband and 6 children and cut off contact with the rest of her family. It was shortly after this, David and Catherine's reign of terror in Perth would begin. After beginning a de facto relationship with David and even changing her last name to Bernie by deed poll, they moved into the infamous murder house at number 3 Moorehouse Street in Perth, in the suburb of Willoughby. Outwardly, they were a quiet and reserved young couple, but inside that house, chaos reigned. They were experimenting with drugs and David's proclivity for kinky sex. Catherine was expected to sleep with David at least 6 times per day. Add to this, David was continually in trouble with the law, and that saw him in and out of jail on a regular basis. Soon David would start involving Catherine in discussing his fantasies of her watching him violently assaulting other women, and that it would be stimulating for her to watch. I know, I can't believe I just said that. Under his thrall since the age of 12, it didn't take much to convince Catherine that this was a great idea, and it wasn't long before mere discussion descended into an actual plan to kidnap and assault somebody from their own community. It was decided by the pair that they would drive around Perth's roads and streets, and if Catherine spotted somebody that she approved of David taking home to assault while she watched, and this is sick, I can't even believe I'm going to say this, and I cannot say this in any context after this case. This is messed up. Truly insidious. I've got the munchies. And if David also found the victim acceptable, he would reply, "Yeah, I've got the munchies too." So they planned for months how they would choose and lure their victims, using Catherine as a reassuring female presence. All that was left now was to find the perfect opportunity. And it was about to come up. In 1986, as David was working his new job as a spare parts mechanic, David meets their first victim, Mary Nielsen, 22. She came to the junkyard where David was working, looking for a spare part for her car. David, seeing his opportunity, told Mary that if she came round to his house, he could give her a better deal, and he gave her his address and phone number. They then arranged for Mary to come to the house at 5 p.m. on October 6, 1986. She arrived, knocked on the door, and was invited inside by David. She had no sooner set foot in the house as she was grabbed by David and held at knife point and dragged into the bedroom. Catherine then watched as Mary was stripped, gagged and chained to the bed, where David repeatedly assaulted her over a number of hours. Catherine was cheering him on and giving him ideas of what he should do to Mary. When they were done, they would then force Mary into their car and drive to Glen Eagle State Forest. They then stopped at a deserted spot near the Albany Highway, where David assaulted Mary again and then used a nylon cord to choke her until she was dead. They then put her in a shallow grave where David would stab her in the chest, believing that it would help speed up the decomposition, after which he would mutilate her body and then bury her. And then he and Catherine would just get in their car, drive home, and start discussing what they wanted to do next. David would then take Mary's car and park it beside the local police station, which was actually a smart move on his part, as it took the police 6 days after Mary was reported missing to realise the car that was parked right beside the station was hers. It was only 2 weeks later that David and Catherine began trolling Perth streets for their next victim. They apparently had had so much fun the first time that they could not wait to do it again. Susanna Candy, aged 15, was walking along the Stirling Highway in Claremont. She was from a good family and she was an honours student at Hollywood High School. Her father Douglas was the top ophthalmologic surgeon in WA and was extremely protective of his daughter. He wasn't happy when she got a part-time job even, and would meet her after work so that she would get home safely. So it really begs the question of why. How did she end up where she was? She was on October 20, 1986, walking alone. David and Catherine pulled over and offered her a ride. As planned, Susanna felt very safe as Catherine was in the car. They looked like a normal and friendly couple, and Susan accepted their offer of a ride. She was no sooner in the vehicle and David held her at knife point, and they drove her back to the house at 3 Moorehouse Street. They then forced her to write letters to her family that she had run away to stay with friends in Queensland and that she was safe and she would be home soon. It was after this she was taken to the bedroom, gagged, chained and assaulted. This time, Catherine would actually join in. And this is a woman who has children of her own. She has daughters. And this is a 15-year-old child. I mean, Susanna's still a little girl at this stage. She's still a child, yet Catherine joins in. Susan would endure days of torture and sexual assault before David would try to choke her with a nylon cord. But she fought so hard with him and so long that they had to force feed her sleeping pills to finally make her compliant enough for them. Catherine was at this time beginning to feel jealous of Susanna because David was keeping her for what Catherine deemed way too long and had always assumed that he would be the one to finally end her life. However, as Susan lay unconscious from the sleeping pills, David handed Catherine the nylon cord and told her, "Prove to me that you love me." And I cannot believe this. This is so beyond sick. It's just unimaginable. Catherine would then go on to kill Susanna. satisfied at proving how much she loved David, and then they drove back to Glen Eagle State Forest, where they would proceed to bury Susanna Candy next to the body of Mary Nielsen. They then mailed one of Suzanne's letters to her parents the following week, with a second letter 2 weeks later. Her parents, knowing their daughter wouldn't have just disappeared without a trace, reported her missing the very same day the Bernies picked her up, and didn't believe a word of these letters when they arrived. They knew something was wrong. To the police, however, they took it as she was just another runaway. They never went and searched for Susanna, and she is a 15-year-old child. You know, she was doing well in school, she was happy, she got on well with her family, she wouldn't just walk out and disappear. And then after only 1 week, they were looking for their next victim. The resting phase between each victim was becoming shorter and shorter. 31-year-old Noeline Patterson, a bar manager at the local golf club, a beautiful and outgoing young woman, would unfortunately be their next victim. On November 1st, after leaving work for the day, she was unlucky enough to have her car run out of petrol on the Canning Highway. David and Catherine would see Noeline standing by the side of the road, and Noeline was actually really happy when she saw David and Catherine pulling up beside her. She knew these people, and she was so happy. Okay, I know these people, they can give me a lift, I can get petrol, I can get my car back on the road. A few weeks earlier, they had a strange coincidence happen, and they had helped Noeline wallpaper a room in her own house. And so when they pulled up and offered the help of a lift, she gladly got right in and accepted to take a ride with them. And they would do to Noeline what they had done to their previous 2 victims, Susanna Candy and Mary Nielsen. They had planned to kill Noeline later that night, but David had become attached to her, as Noeline was extremely beautiful and David seemed captivated with her, and will go on to keep her for another 3 days, until Catherine again would become jealous and held a knife to Noeline's throat and threatened to do the job herself if David did not do it right away. So again, he force feeds his victims sleeping pills, strangled her to death, all while Catherine stood by and watched. They then drove her back to Glen Eagle State Forest and buried her beside Mary Nielsen and Susanna Candy. On November 5, just days after burying Noeline, they moved on to their next victim, Denise Brown, 21, a computer programmer and part-time nanny. She was waiting for the bus on the Sterling Highway, and again the same fate would befall Denise Brown. This time they would force her to call her parents and tell them that she was safe. They would also keep Denise for 2 days, and then they would drive her to Pine Plantation in the suburb of Winaroo, where she would be assaulted by David a further 3 times and stabbed in the chest. They then dug a shallow grave and pushed Denise in it, and whilst they were trying to bury Denise, Denise would suddenly sit up, gasping for air. Even after all this, Denise was still alive. However, she wouldn't be for long, as David would then go on to bludgeon Denise to death. They then finished burying her and left. It was after this they would go on to abduct who would become their final victim, Kate Moore. And I'm not going to include a picture of Kate because Kate survives and actually gets away. And this was where their sick and twisted world of rape and torture would finally come to an end. On November 9, just a few days after the murder of Denise Brown, Kate Moore was spotted walking through a wealthy suburb in Perth. It was late and Kate was more than a little tipsy, so she chose to walk home. Soon, a friendly-looking couple pulled up and offered her a ride. Kate, kind of drunk, thought, okay, great, these people can give me a ride home. She thought nothing of it, climbed right in and gave them directions to her home. As they drove, the woman suddenly said, "I've got the munchies. How about you? Do you have the munchies?" This is so creepy. I'm never going to be able to say that again even when I'm really hungry. It's just, ugh. They then pulled up to Kate's address. They actually took her home, and it was here Kate would realise that there was no handle on the inside of the door, that she was trapped. David then pulled a knife, holding it to Kate's throat. Kate then asked them point blank, "Are you going to kill me? Are you going to sexually assault me?" To which they would reply, "Yes, we are." They then drove her to their house and forced her inside. So Kate's thinking at this time, I have a 5% chance of escaping and a 95 to 200% a chance of being killed. What followed next for Kate was an extremely weird few hours. They would first share a joint with Kate and then force her to dance for them, Kate crying with fear the entire time. They would play the Dire Straits song Romeo and Juliet and interviewed Kate, asking many questions about her life and who was she. Then they would put on Sylvester Stallone's movie Rocky in the VCR recorder and watch it with Kate. She was then forced to shower, which Kate at this point is thinking is extremely strange, as David was about to assault her and appeared wearing a short mustard-coloured robe and nothing else. After which he would go on to assault Kate, force her to shower again and chain her to the bed, all while Catherine just stood by watching. Kate then asked for a pen and paper to write goodbye notes to her family. However, unbeknownst to the Bernies, Kate had found opportunities during the night while she was unchained to plant evidence of her abduction, and at the time thought to be by Kate her impending murder, all over the house at 3 Moorehouse Street. She wanted to leave proof that after her murder she had been inside the home. She planted a tube of her lipstick in the couch. She made a very distinct drawing on a scrap of paper that she would also hide. She pushed her handbag and a pack of cigarettes inside the ceiling, and she touched as many surfaces in the house as she could leave behind her fingerprints and DNA. And then she was put in the guest room to sleep, but this is where she did make a critical mistake. She then made the mistake of screaming as loud as she could, hoping to alert one of the neighbours, which saw an angry David drag Kate into the bedroom he shared with Catherine, where she would be repeatedly assaulted, cuffed to David, and forced to ingest sleeping pills. However, Kate was one step ahead of these guys, and she hid the pills under her tongue, and when she was sure David had fallen asleep, she spat them out and she hid them under the mattress. She knew that if she went to sleep, odds were she would possibly never wake up again. In the morning, David would then make Kate call her mother and let her know she had gotten very drunk the night before and had crashed at a friend's, adding if she said anything else to alert her mother, he would kill her on the spot, just like all the others. Kate was hoping her mother would realise that it was out of character for Kate to have been that drunk and realise something was off, but Kate's mother didn't. She didn't realise anything was off at all. So the phone call done, and David leaves for work. Kate is now thinking she has at least a 50-50 chance of surviving if she can make a break for it before David returns. Kate was thinking about trying to befriend and perhaps manipulate Catherine into letting her go. But before she could even try out this plan, something happened. Somebody knocked on the door. And it turns out it was Catherine's drug dealer, who she was expecting, and she went to answer the door, leaving Kate unrestrained. Kate knew this was the only chance that she would get to escape. So as Catherine leaves the room, Kate jumps up, she shoves open a window, and she threw herself out. She lands hard in the driveway, hitting her head, but she doesn't let this stop her, and she takes off. She runs across the street first. She's looking for help from 4 neighbouring houses, but nobody answers. Everybody's either at school or at work, and there's nobody home. So she then turns around and runs back to the house. She jumps over a gate, where she is then attacked by David's dog. But still, that does not stop Kate. She then jumps the fence and ran as fast as she could towards a straw across the street, where the owner was actually standing out front, and she ran up to him, begging him for help. She was dressed, she had bare feet, but she was only dressed in a pair of tights and her black tank top, and she was barefoot in rough shape, and she begs the man to call the police, telling him, I've just been assaulted, I've just been kidnapped, and if a woman follows me here claiming to be my mother, don't believe her. Please call the police. So the man, seeing Kate's distress, calls the police, and Kate was then taken straight to Palmyra Police Station, where she talked to Rookie Officer Laura Hancock. And this may have been because the police were at first doubting her story. However, once Kate had ID'd David Burney as one of her captors, Detective Paul Ferguson took over the case. They had multiple missing persons cases of young women, all who had similar victimology to Kate. They were all happy young women from stable homes who had no reason to run away or disappear. David and Catherine had given Kate fake names, but Kate had seen David's real name on a prescription label on a medicine bottle in the home. She had also memorised the address and the phone number and gave detailed descriptions of both David and Catherine. She said the woman was mid-30s with prominent cheekbones, skinny, a permanent frown and dark hair, and the male was also mid-30s, also skinny and had a hook nose. Kate would then bravely accompany the police back to the address and positively ID the house, and how frightening that must have been from Kate to be able to go back to the place she had been held, assaulted and tortured for hours on end. Although nobody was home on the police's arrival, officers then went to David's work to pick him up and place him under arrest, and then they waited at the home for Catherine to arrive and would then arrest her as well. At first, Catherine would go on to say she didn't know Kate, she'd never met her. Being interviewed in a second room, David would admit to knowing who Kate was. However, he would lie to the police, saying that she came over of her own free will. Yeah, they got high, they had sex, it was all consensual, they had a drink, it was all fun. However, upon searching the home, police found everything Kate told them that she had left behind exactly where she told them it would be. Her lipstick shoved into the sofa cushions, her bag of cigarettes hidden in the ceiling, and the tape of Rocky was still in the VCR, just as she had described to them. After this, David was then the first to confess. He admitted to the sexual assault and murders of Mary Nielsen, Denise Brown, Susanna Candy, and Noeline Patterson. He would go on to tell them where the remains were located, and after this, the police told Catherine that David had told them everything, and as soon as she knew that, she then caved. She admitted to being a willing participant and had even taken photos of David assaulting the young women. Catherine also would show no emotion and no remorse over the atrocities that she and David had committed. Not one tear was shed. She was cold and matter-of-fact as she gave her account of her part in the torture and murders, saying that she would become jealous of the young women because they were so pretty, they were so young, and she had gotten immense pleasure out of David assaulting and finally murdering them. This is a woman with children of her own who would be becoming young women at this stage as well. She did, however, go on to say that she let Kate escape as she knew she wanted the murders to stop, even though she had enjoyed it. She even offered to show the detectives where the victims' graves were located, so it was in handcuffs David and Catherine led detectives to the graves of Susanna Candy, Mary Nielsen and Noeline Patterson in Glen Eagle State Forest, and then to the grave of Denise Brown at Pine Plantation in Winaroo. As the case gained notoriety, the media would go on to name it the Moorehouse murders after the street where the house was located. In the weeks that followed, a 19-year-old woman would come forward to tell police that she had also been offered a ride by the Bernies as she walked by the university that she was attending at the time. Catherine had waved her over, but before she got in the car, she had noticed another young person who she wasn't sure if it was a guy or if it was a girl at this stage, unconscious in the back seat, and this really freaked her out and she took off and refused the ride, turned it down flat. The young person that she had seen in the back seat had turned out to be Denise Brown, their last known murder victim, drugged and unconscious. Upon searching the house, the police also found a classified ad that the Bernies had placed looking for a young woman to rent a spare room to. And that was how they were trying to lure their first victim when they were first trying to figure out how they could abduct and murder people. But nobody knows if this actually worked, leading police to suspect that there may have been more victims that nobody knew about, including Cheryl Renwick, who went missing in the May of 1986, and Barbara Weston, who disappeared in July of 1986. On November 12, 1986, the couple was charged with 4 counts of murder, 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault, and 1 count of deprivation of liberty. In February 1987, the Bernies attended a hearing and pled guilty to all charges. The trial was in 1987 and only lasted 30 minutes. They were both sentenced to consecutive life sentences, with the judge adding the order never to be released to David's records, with Catherine being eligible for parole in 2007. However, the Australian Attorney General made a public statement saying it was extremely unlikely that either of them would ever be released from prison. David was sent to a maximum security prison and was getting into constant fights with the other inmates. He was eventually moved to solitary and then to converted cells that used to be for death row. And it was after this he was soon moved to another maximum security prison in WA in 1990, when the prison that he was currently incarcerated in closed down. While Catherine was sent to Bandy Up Women's Prison, which houses female inmates of all security classes. David Burney was then found deceased in his cell at 4:30 a.m. October 7, 2005. He had hung himself with a bedsheet strung from an air vent. This was after a clerical error saw his prescription of antidepressant medication be cancelled by mistake. David was 54 years old. Catherine applied for parole in 2007 and 2009, but was denied each time after requests from the families of her victims asked that Catherine never be released. Catherine is only the third female prisoner in Australia to have paperwork signed, never to be released. Catherine is now 70 years of age and is the longest serving prisoner at Bandy Up and remains one of Western Australia's most notorious serial killers. Kate Moore, the sole survivor of the Burneys, went on to start a campaign in 2017 to stop mandatory parole reviews, which take place every 3 years. This was in order to prevent victims going through further trauma and re-traumatisation. A campaign that was supported by Catherine's own youngest son, Peter, who has been the subject of harassment and bullying by being related to Catherine. He has stated that he believes his mother should be put to death. As for the Moorehouse Street house, the House of Horrors, it still stands to this day and has had 5 different owners since the Burneys' arrest in 1986. And I can't imagine why anybody would want to, rent or buy a house with this history. I personally think it should have been bulldozed, but the house is still there. And that is where we will leave today's case. But before we end it off, I would like to pay respects to the victims. Mary Nielsen, Susanna Candy, Nolene Patterson, Denise Brown, sole survivor Kate Moore, suspected victims Cheryl Renwick and Barbara Weston. And if the content in this video has raised any issues for you, I will be including some numbers at the end of the video that you can call to talk to somebody if you feel you need help. And that's going to do it for today. I will be back here at the same time next week with another disturbing, true Australian crime case. Until then, I'll see you all next time. Stay safe out there. Be aware of your surroundings. And don't accept a ride from anybody you don't know, even if they have a woman or a child in the car. As seen with today's case, you cannot trust anybody that you don't know. Please stay safe, everybody, and I'll see you all again soon. And thank you so much for watching. Bye.